Stamp Chat is recording. Hi friends, this is Heidi. Welcome to the American Philatelic Society Stamp Chat. We're so happy to have you. Happy Monday. I hope that everybody enjoyed a refreshing weekend and that you were able to work on your collections or be inspired in some form or fashion to pick up a new avenue, or are really using these stamp chats as a catalyst for exploring your collections in new ways, and better yet, finding people to get excited with and to get them excited. I know that I spent this weekend sharing the YouTube that Graham Beck made last week and just getting people fired up. I had my stepmother say that she wanted to become an American Philatelic member, so another one for the books. And I hope that you guys are also helping to make the 2020 challenge a reality. That's 2020 new members to the APS by the end of the year, and I'm sure that we can do it, especially with all the passion that's in our hobby at the moment. And we have 100+ years full of that, of momentum, and people really enjoying this hobby. So thank you so much for being on the call and for encouraging us. And again, APS offers a lot of great member benefits, a lot of which are now free through the end of May to non-members. You can check out the digital library. You can see the AP and really get a feel and a flavor for the APS. So I welcome you to share our website, stamps.org, with friends and family. Today we have Director of Expertising, Mr. Gary Loew, joining us from Atlanta in the safety of his home. And we're really excited to have him. It's been a couple weeks, and we know that he's one of our show's favorites. So welcome, Gary. So good to have you back.
Thank you, Heidi. It's always fun to be back. Just to make sure, can you see the whole splash screen now, or are you seeing a partial?
Can see the whole screen.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you everybody for showing up. What I'm going to be talking about today is what I've titled Beyond Watermark Fluid, although we certainly won't ignore watermark fluid, but just some different ways to understand and identify the stamps that you have. Many of these are ways, well, jeepers, that you all use now, and some of them are ways that in the near future, perhaps you will all be able to use. So today I'm going to talk about three things. I'll spend a moment on traditional ways of studying and analyzing stamps. I'm going to talk about a recent adventure of mine in analytical philately with an area of stamp collecting that I specialize in. And then we'll talk about some modern ways to study ink, paper, including watermarks, and gum. But as far as traditional ways are concerned, obviously the magnifying glass is at the heart of philately, and I don't care how many fancy toys you acquire, you will never eliminate your need for a magnifying glass, whether you're in your stamp room or dining room table working on your stamps, or whether you're out in the field or at a stamp show. You remember stamp shows, looking at what a vendor has to offer you. Those dealers either have magnifying glasses or you're bringing your own. Color is something that we all care a lot about, and there are a whole bunch of different ways, including stamp keys, to identify color. What we've got here is a photo of the Stanley Gibbons stamp color key, but each of the major catalog publishers have their own version. Some are better than this, some are not quite as good as this. All of them have their own unique coloring to it. Sorry about that. Perforation gauges at the American Philatelic Center's expertising department. I think I counted 35 different perf gauges, not all of which we always use, and some of them are better for certain tasks than others, but you're always going to need a perf gauge if you're collecting perforated stamps. And my favorite, watermark detection fluid, seen here with a traditional black watermarking tray. Now, if we have time at the end of the talk, after my little thank you screen, I'm going to go into a bonus session that includes involving a jar of Skippy peanut butter in the watermarking process. So I hope I've tempted you with that little tidbit to see how we use a jar of Skippy peanut butter in the watermarking process. Other, nowadays pretty traditional, for a long time actually, pretty traditional ways of evaluating and understanding your stamps is with detecting ink fluorescence using long wave and using shortwave ultraviolet for detecting ink phosphorescence. So those are two standard tools nowadays, and they're pretty readily detectable. But let me tell you a bit about this adventure I had. It started off a couple of years ago, actually, but continues to this very day, and will start up again once I get back to Bellefonte. I'm at my other home in Atlanta at the moment, but once I rejoin the APS in a week or two, I'll be picking up on this project. What you see here is a sheet, complete sheet of the Gambia stamps from the 1880 to 1898 period. These are Stanley Gibbons, either 26 or 27. And the value is, one of the reasons I collect this stamp is because of the value is tuppenny halfpenny. It's one of the few excuses I have to pronounce 2.5 pennies that way. Anyway, some years ago, 2011, there was a book published on the Gambia perforated cameos. The tuppenny halfpenny I just showed you was one of those. John Rose was the dean of Gambia philately, sadly up until his death right after this book was published. He had a table in there on those tuppenny halfpennies that identified 9 printings, and this table shows you the printing and watermark, quantities that were delivered, the type of perforation that was being used, the color or shade, and some other diagnostic characteristics. If you look on the right side of the screen, you'll see a larger version that's perhaps more readable, but it says, the color and shades went from pale to bright ultramarine for the first shipment, deep grayish ultramarine to bright blue for the second shipment, bright ultramarine for the third shipment, and so on. And then there's some other diagnostic characteristics. So it's really the color, the ink used to differentiate these shipments that was of interest to me. And again, he's identified 9 different shipments, and here are the color descriptions of those 9. And what John Rose had done was build these displays, these sample pages that had 9 of these different shipments, and he identified them. You can see the explosion there, the close-up on the right, with the delivery dates and the date that was stamped. He had a whole bunch of these in his collection. After he passed away and his collection was put up for auction, I was able to acquire at auction 3 of these sets of the 9 shipments as identified. These are from his original collection. So I've got 3 of those sheets on the left. But I had some problems with John's approach. I really wasn't happy with the analytical structure he was using, and the approach really seemed arbitrary. Everybody's got different color perception. You know, one eye could be different from another. Forget about one person to another. So, you know, color perception's a really tricky thing. But I was having a dickens of a time with those 3 sets of 9, discriminating among them, determining whether from set 1 to set 2 to set 3 there was any difference. And, you know, it didn't sit right with me. And my question was, are there new and better scientific ways to understand and study my stamps? And in fact, there are. So let me take a tangent off of that study, which is still in progress, by the way. So I don't have answers for you yet, but I want to talk about the Institute for Analytical Philately, or the IAP. I will probably say IAP because I stumble over the full name of the thing, but I want to give you a background on them and the tools that are used to study ink and color, and some of the tools that are used to study paper, watermarks, and gum. Today, I'm only going to have a chance to talk about ink and color. Maybe at a future talk we can chat about some of the others as well. As far as the IAP is concerned, they are dedicated to sponsoring technical research activities for the betterment of the philatelic hobby. Their goal is to assist philatelists, and not just the uber philatelists, but philatelists like you and I, to gain new insights and understanding of the stamps that we own through some rigorous scientific methods. The really cool thing about the IAP, they're a totally virtual organization. They don't have a headquarters, they don't have a clubhouse, they don't have any equipment. What they have is gobs and gobs, or maybe just one gob, of money. And they issue research grants and provide technical support to what they call qualified philatelists, to assist them in performing all of the work that really needs to be done in this hobby to take it up to the next level. I really recommend, if any of this is of interest to you, you hop over to analyticalphilately.org. That's the web page for the website for the IAP, and it's really worth a visit. Just incredible resources are available there. The 8 things that you need to know about the IAP. These studies, the tools for these studies, use advanced physics and chemistry, but you don't need to be a scientist to either use the tools or understand the results. Now, the equipment that I use, going back a couple of years, is available at the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. One of the tools, the VSC 6000, we have at the expertising department at the American Philatelic Center. So they are around. There are other places where they are available, but the National Postal Museum, really wonderful in this regard. They make that equipment freely available, and they'll help you to perform the tests and make sure that you've got a general comfort level. All you need is a comfort level with PCs, and they will work with you and take it from there. Your job really, well, you're going to do the tests. You're going to take the pretty pictures and run the tests, of course, after you are trained. But your real job is to interpret the results, and that's where some knowledge of physics and chemistry might be thought to be necessary. But in fact, between the National Postal Museum and the IAP and its board and consultants, there's always help available with the interpretation of results. One of the problems I have with all of these wonderful scientific toys is that you get some training in how to generate data, and then you're left on your own to try and figure out what it is you think you found. Without proper analytical expertise to supplement your understanding of the stamps themselves, you can go down some really useless paths and reach some really dysfunctional conclusions. So the trick is know your stamps, know the questions you want to answer, and make sure you hook up with people that are out there and willing to help. So you really want to design a study before you march off in this direction. The really nice thing about the IAP is that those gobs of money come in the form of grants, and you are required to publish an article in a journal that's acceptable to the IAP with your findings. Now, if you look at some of the articles that have been published, you'll see things like this. Not only don't I know what this means, I can't even pronounce it. And, you know, I had calculus, but I don't know what this is about. I know a little bit more about what this is about. This was a paper study, and they're looking at the structure of cellulose, which is what most paper is made from. You see this kind of stuff in some of the articles that gets published. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm perfectly happy with a paper that includes this material in an appendix. But for we mere mortal stamp collectors who are not physicists or other kinds of scientists, beyond our comprehension, we want to know, what was the question? What's the testing that was done in very simple terms? And what are the results? Give me the interpretation of the results in plain layman's terms. I was going to say in English, but some of the best papers aren't even published in English. So it's not language specific, it's level of language specific. And my desire, my quest in assisting the IAP is to make sure that pages that look like this are in the back in an appendix, and you get layman's English in the front. Let's talk a bit about color, because color is complicated. Here's a page out of the IAP website that talks about color science, color philosophy, some standard color terms, and they're the basic terms that I'm most comfortable with: red, green, blue, pink, brown, black, gray, that sort of thing. Some of the other stuff gets really beyond my comprehension, beyond most of us. But each of these phrases that you see here is a link on the IAP website that explains what those terms are about in ways that mostly we can understand. Sometimes they go off the deep end and way into the weeds, but here's the structure that gives you an overall view of just how complicated color is. Of course, we all see color differently. The original ink chemistry remains very stable over time. So if something was printed in 1840, the ink chemistry, even if you get atmospheric changes such as sulfurization, for example, the ink chemistry is going to remain the same, largely the same over time. That's true even if the apparent color changes. Now, as far as color is concerned, Scott, Gibbons, all the others have their own naming standards with those pretty color charts like I showed you, but those standards really vary. So you can't rely on some form of pink being the same meaning to different catalogs. So the real question here is, can modern technology offer any solutions? For example, here's some 1851 stamps. It's all the same stamp, but different printings and different time periods and different plates that were used, and also different inks. So for each of these stamps, there are 3 choices, and you have to figure out which of these possible choices is the correct one for these stamps? Now, this is not a pop quiz, so I'll give you the answer, and you can see that to the left is bright orange brown, and the third one over is rose brown, and they look sort of similar. And then if you take the second from the left, it's dull claret, and if you take the one over on the right, it's a deep orange brown, and yet they look sort of similar. They're differentiable, but they look sort of similar. So yeah, color is complicated, and measuring color is best done, at least initially, using colorimetry. Two ways that light works on a stamp. You can measure reflectance. You shine a light and light bounces off. You measure that reflectance as one way of measuring a color. The other is absorption. If I shine that light on the surface, some of it doesn't bounce off, it gets absorbed. And you measure what's missing as a measure of a stamp's true color, if you will. Other aspects of color include identifying the elements in the ink formula. And there's a whole bunch of other quantitative techniques as well. You know, there's a question called, what about using your scanner? Well, scanners may work if you've got some detailed software, some specialized software to measure the results. But let's take a look at some of the different concepts, some of the different aspects in color, like color space, which is, a color space is a means of organizing colors. Rainbows are a means of organizing colors. The stamp keys that I showed you, like that one, and you know, a Pantone pad of colors like this is another way of looking at it. So color keys are helpful. There are two ways of looking at color in a different dimension. There's the red, green, blue, which is the color formulations that come out of your computer monitors. And then in the printing world, they use a different way of creating color, which is CYMK, cyan, yellow, blah, blah, blah. That's used in printing. But there's another way of measuring color, and that's the colorimetry color space. Here's an example of one color space. And this is what's called a color space chromaticity diagram. This is the little graphic that is produced using a VSC 6000, which was one of the tools that I used at the National Postal Museum. Okay. So we've got here one of the standards of a color space. This is the 1930. That's not the year. That's just a numerical measure of it, numerical descriptor of it, that defines how color can be measured. This is, again, the graphic representation, and that's produced by this Foster and Freeman VSC 6000. Again, we've got one of these that we've begun using over the last several months. VSC Video Spectral Comparator. Here's a picture of the late David Herendeen using the VSC at the National Postal Museum. David Herendeen was one of the founders and the founding president of the IAP, and absolutely brilliant guy. Miss him very much, but he really got IAP started. When using a VSC 6000, you end up, after the testing is done, with something that looks like this. You get the graphic representation of the color space on the right, you get all the data at the top right, but over on the left, you see the graphic representation of different reflectivities for different stamps. So here we've got 3, 4, 5, 6 different tests that were run on 6 different stamps. And if you look at the top grouping of 4, I guess there's 7 altogether. If you look at the top grouping of 4, you'll see that over the broad spectrum of light, and this goes from the ultraviolet to the infrared, you're down from 400 nanometers to 1,000 nanometers. If you look at the bottom of that graph, you'll see that most of the light showing there, or most of the color showing there, is black, because that's beyond the ability of the human eye to see. But look at the differences between the 2 collections of tests that were done. In the invisible area, the infrared area is showing measurably different curves. So in the visible spectrum, the left hand 1/3, those graphs are mapping pretty closely. But when you get up into the invisible areas, that's where the inks really start behaving differently. And you can tell that these were built, printed using different inks. So you're measuring reflectance by doing something like this. You shine a beam of light, and at the different wavelengths, you can see how the stamp behaves. So here's that picture again. There's a close-up of it, and you can see that we're really looking at 2 different printings. Now, the stamps themselves on the upper group and the stamps themselves on the lower group, while they're highly similar, are not identical. You know, if I take the same formula for ink and I put a little more of some color in or some chemical in than others from day 1 to day 3 of the same print run, that could account for differences like this. Okay, but another way to look at ink is to identify elements in the ink formulas. And the tool for using that is called X-ray fluorescence, XRF. And what you do is you bounce X-rays off the surface of a stamp and see what fluoresces. And that's the information that you capture. Here's a picture of the Brucker portable X-ray fluorescence machine. This one is at the National Postal Museum. And if you look at the bottom left of that picture, you'll see one of the stamps, stamp collections of 9 that I was testing. So you put the stamp on top of the X-ray fluorescence device, the Brucker. You put the little hat on top so that it doesn't bounce X-rays all over the place. And here's the results that you come up with. We're not looking at chemical compounds here. We're looking at elements. So X-ray fluorescence is not dealing with compounds, but elements. And you can see that for a particular stamp, these are the relative proportions of particular elements, lead, barium, selenium, strontium, zinc, all the chemicals or all the elements that would go into producing an ink. Okay. So when you're using a magnifying glass, you put the stamp under the magnifying glass, and pretty much you want to study the image and figure out what you're staring at. When you're using watermark fluid, you don't have to worry about principles of chemistry. You just take a look at what the watermark fluid is showing you. With modern technology, you put the stamp into the device or on the device, and you look at the data and see what the results are. So those are like 3 different ways of understanding your stamps. And when it comes to the 3 different series of 9 that I'm working on, I'll let you know when I figured out what it is I've been staring at. All right, so let me Let me go to the bonus round because I've got time left over here. I showed you this earlier. This is watermark detection fluid, and in a black watermark tray. But there are improved ways of watermark detection, one of which involves Skippy peanut butter. Well, not Skippy peanut butter, but the Skippy peanut butter jar. Or to be more specific, the blue cap on top. What I'm suggesting is that for certain colors of stamps, the black watermark tray just doesn't cut it. Specifically, for example, orange stamps don't watermark very well when it comes to orange stamps. The black tray just doesn't give you the right contrast. But if you take the blue top from a Skippy peanut butter jar, scrape all the peanut butter off, and use that as a watermark tray for orange stamps, your watermark is going to show up, it's going to really pop much more dramatically than in a black tray. Why is that? Well, we're talking about complements. Remember the color wheel? Well, the opposite of orange is blue on your color wheel. Same thing is true with a yellow stamp. The opposite of yellow is purple. So use a purple watermark tray for yellow stamps, and the watermark itself will pop quite dramatically. There's an extension of that I've just begun experimenting with fairly decent results, and this is what I want to close with. Take a standard LED light box. You can get one of these at Amazon for some 20 bucks or so. Get some transparent color correction gel filters, and you can get a package of those as shown here for about 10 bucks. So for $35, you've got a complete tool set. All you need to do is take the light box, and you see down the bottom right corner, there are a couple of clips there. Clip onto the light box one of these colored gel filters, put the stamp on top, put watermark fluid on it. The light will shine through. You will get the color filtering of the gel filter. And depending, obviously you have to pick the color that's identical to the, the opposite rather, of the stamp that you're testing. But you're going to see watermarks in a whole new way. As I said, I've just begun playing around with this, but it's a really great way of expanding traditional watermark detecting with watermark fluid and a black tray. And that's what I got for you.
Yay, thank you, Gary. And with that, I know Markin's got a question for you. So Markin, if you'll go ahead and unmute yourself, hon. Welcome.
I'm on mute. Wonderful presentation. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Very interesting subject. And I'm still awake, middle of the night, 1 o'clock here in India. But I don't want to miss this one. 2 questions,
Okay.
Gary.
Well, I'd share my coffee with you if I could.
That's our Gary.
I will cheers with the bottle. Okay. The first question is, some of the stamps in early issues, particularly in India, a large watermark covering the entire sheet, imperf issues. I think you have heard my presentation, the 2 Anna
Yes.
printed on 1 Anna.
Yep,
Blah, blah, blah. So when it comes to this subject, and then we had the single star watermark in India, but more precisely, the problem is sometimes in detection, when the engraving area usually is thinner than the other area of the stamps, because the engraved area is thin, and that's why we have the watermark. It's very simple. Now what happens when the paper is thin and the engraved area obviously is thinner than the stamp paper area? When it gets the the stamp area gets more thinner, and then the watermark sometimes disappears. And bloody, that is a big challenge. I will definitely try this color tray therapy, the peanut butter and all these things you mentioned in the bonus round, which was very interesting to me. So I would love to try that, but that is sometimes, you know, it's a pain in the neck. So I am not able to reach to the conclusion how to justify what is the watermark. And if there is one watermark you are saying that we are staring at, okay, if it is a star watermark or crown watermark or blah, 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 one watermark in one stamp is easy. But when it's a one watermark affecting the whole sheet and you are looking at a small portion of that entire watermark, how to justify and reach to the conclusion that what exactly it is? Can you please help me and shed some light on this?
Oh boy. Well, I think I'm going to take a page or a slide from your own presentation, because what you were describing was the equivalent of plating a stamp on a sheet, except it's not the image of the stamp that you're plating, it's the watermark of the stamp that you're plating. So the location is identifying the location is dependent on the structure of the overall sheet. And you pointed out quite exquisitely the challenges when different watermarks were appearing and there were slight shifts. You know, it's very, very complicated. What I'm finding, though, as I experiment with the VSC 6000, is that a combination of different wavelengths of light, either reflected light or transmitted light, will show up a watermark more clearly than physically the watermark is. Now,
I'm getting you.
You know, I'm lucky. I've got a $130,000 tool 25 feet from me, so I can just get up and examine a stamp. If you've got a spare $130,000, I highly recommend the piece of equipment. It's probably cheaper on the used market, but you know, even something as basic as a signoscope, which is used for watermark detection with varying results and varying people's opinions, even a signoscope is a $500 device. So some of these tools and toys are pretty expensive. The other thing about watermark, though, is changing the angle of the light from directly above and angling it down gradually, which the VSC does, but which one can do manually as well. What I find very helpful, and again, I'm talking about the VSC, but you can make a Rube Goldberg that would do this as well, is take two light sources, mount them on a, like a microscope mount that you can run them up and down so you can get different angles of projection, and then alternate left and right. What I like using is a USB microscope on top so I can record the image, and then angled light bouncing off the stamp, so I'll get a shadow from one direction and a shadow from the other direction. You can sometimes nurse out watermarks.
You are lucky. Sometimes
that are uncooperative. But this is. You go ahead.
I'm sorry. Please continue.
I was just going to say, this is as much art as it is science.
Yeah.
So
what I do, it's very interesting what all you have described. So we have same wavelength. My office staff is sometimes, you know, becomes very pathetic, because what happens, I ask them to shut off all my cabin lights, give me a dark room right now, because I'm looking at a stamp, I'm crazy. And then I do whatever you have described. I have this powerful LED also, which you can see here, which is in my hand. and I use this one, and I use the multiple angles and all these things. But sometimes it's very painful. But at the same time, it's an excitement as well. You know what I mean? So
This is
I'm
detective
enjoying.
work.
Second question. Okay, now the first issue, what I have discovered, the unusual watermark in the Indian first issue, 2 Anna stamps. Now, initially, I just found the unusual watermark. And then later on, I found the usages abroad, because the Indian Postal Circle used to supply the stamps to Aden as well.
Right.
Okay. So this unusual watermark is now used in Aden as well. And later on, I also found that it was used at Aden steamer point with a different postmark. And then I found and discovered a usage from Pondicherry, which is a French settlements of India. And Pondicherry was the capital.
Mm-hmm.
Initially found one example, then second one, then the third one. And Aden, I have nearly now 7 examples. And now I'm putting all together. And now I am talking 2 things at a time, your color theory and your watermark theory. So I have combined both to reach to the conclusion that how many sheets according to the shades could have been supplied, or in the worst case, a traveler had traveled with that particular stamp of that shade, and it has been used from that particular territory. But the big challenge, which is that the different stamps, now 160 years, survived in various climates, weathers, different countries, and everything all together. How one can reach to the conclusive real color of the stamp in which the stamp was printed in 1854?
Okay. Well, you use the phrase "real color." I'm not sure that such a thing exists. What there is ink metrics. Okay. Using a VSC 6000, you can do color reflectivity studies as well as with the ultraviolet and infrared bands, look at other behaviors of inks. But really, you want to do 2 things. You want to understand the elements, which is where the elements contained in the ink, which is where X-ray fluorescence comes in. But you really want to get into the compounds, especially when you get into the later 19th century inks, where you're starting to get organic compounds included in inks. The X-ray fluorescence is of limited use because it's really the chemistry of the compounds that makes the difference in inks. So for that period of time, 1860, 1870s forward, where you've got much more organic chemistry involved, you really need to go to something called FTIR, Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, because that'll get you into the compounds themselves. That equipment is becoming more readily available for philatelists, but it's certainly not easily accessible. You got to travel to get to it or send your stamps to where it is. But the inks really stay stable over time. If you are chemically treating a stamp, whether it's something as overt as bleaching out a portion of a tablet at the bottom of a stamp so you could make a different denomination. You know, the forgers are famous for doing things like that. Or just exposing a stamp to sunlight and having the sunlight bleach it out. What's really intriguing is that the underlying chemistry of the ink that was originally still there is still there in trace amounts. So one can determine with this equipment what used to be there, even if it's no longer visible. Another example, even using X-ray fluorescence, is if I've got a stamp that has sulfurized. People say oxidized. That's absolutely the wrong term. Nothing oxidizes except for a metallic stamp. It's sulfurizing. It's absorbing sulfur.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. So if you want to fix a sulfurized stamp, you oxidize it. You give it a little coating of hydrogen peroxide, and that oxidizes the stamp, which gets rid of the sulfurization. So, but even with a sulfurized stamp, it's absorbed sulfur. If you put that kind of a stamp on an X-ray fluorescence detecting device, you will see the characteristic spike in that graph for the sulfur element, and you will know that's a sulfurized version of some other stamp. So if I've got a collection of stamps and I test them all and I've got the profiles, I can do things like differencing between stamp 1 and stamp 2, subtract it out and see where the differences come in, leaving the residual from stamp 2 behind or from stamp 1 behind. I can see the elemental difference, and if these are two identical stamps, one of which has been sulfurized, the net of those two is going to be that sulfur spike. So there are ways of using X-ray fluorescence all by itself to detect chemical changes that have taken place.
Wow, thank you very much for a very detailed answer. So I knew a lot of things today. Thank you very much, Gary.
Fantastic, and capturing on that momentum. Would CJ like to unmute herself? I know that she was busy writing notes, and come on in.
Well, I want to thank Gary for this. It's been really interesting. One thing I wanted to add is that my makeshift technique for watermarks, especially with envelopes, which are much bigger. I work on a glass top desk, so I just lay the envelope on my desk and then I use my phone to shine a light underneath it. Like a little light box.
Here's the light box. And it's controllable, and it's LED, it's pure white, and you can control the brightness of it. So I think it's $23 on Amazon, and I don't know how I lived with it, lived without it previously, because it's just a joy to use, and you can see watermarks just through the transmitted light that you wouldn't see normally. And so yeah, I like your technique, and for $23 you can have one that's less of a Rube Goldberg and easier to control from a light density standpoint. But yeah, so that's great.
Doing that way really helps too with if I am like writing up about it, I can trace the watermark and then use that to show what it is if you aren't looking at it through a light box.
Yep. Have you used a USB microscope at low magnification on top of the light box?
No, I haven't, but I just got one of those USB microscopes. I know that they're just like cameras, but they are so handy to just zoom in and see those differences.
Yeah, and it's much easier to record, photographically record through a USB microscope. You can create some great images, and they're going straight to your computer.
Yeah, and I find that so much easier than scanning it at a high resolution and then trying to zoom in, because even when you scan it at a high resolution, it still blurs. But that microscope takes the picture at that high resolution already. Exactly. I wanted to add one more thing. I don't know if it's in this issue of the American Philatelist, but in one of them it had a the YPFL fellows, or the YPFL members. One of them was making a color analyzer. Have you used that?
I don't know that it's available. I think he is still in process of developing it. I have to tell you, when I saw this gentleman's recording of this gentleman's presentation, I was just so excited. from many standpoints. A, from the technical standpoint of what it is he's trying to accomplish, but B, looking at a young person, bright, smart, motivated young philatelist coming into the hobby and already making a contribution like that. I know there are an awful lot of naysayers in this hobby about the future of philately. I will tell you, I'm just the opposite. I am wildly enthusiastic about the future of the hobby, and that young man is a perfect example of why I feel that way.
Thank you.
Those are, that's very rousing, and I'll go back to Mark and Dave, who has a follow-up.
Gary, I would like to share something with you.
Please.
Because my watermark, what I have discovered is, it's affecting the entire sheet.
Mm-hmm.
Some part of the sheet, I must say. So what I have done is that I have prepared a tracing of that watermark, and then what I have done, printed it in a very crazy way. Look at this one. Can you see it?
Oh, now I can. Yeah. Huh. So what have you printed that on? What is that?
On a plastic, on a transparent plastic.
Okay.
Okay. Now the usage of this crazy thing is, I have this stamp, okay?
Yeah.
And I'm doubting that it is falling on this area where you can see my finger, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I put it and try to match like this. And going through the light, this black printed area is blocking the watermark area. And it easily proves that this is this watermark area of that particular stamp. Another thing, why I printed it on plastic, a transparent plastic, you can see my face through,
Mm-hmm.
Why I printed on a transparent plastic? Because if it is inverted watermark and I want to match with my stamp, it's inverted now. Okay, if I want to study it as a reverse watermark, I can do it, I can flip it and it's reverse. If it is reverse and inverted, then I will flip it reverse and I put it inverted and then try to match with the stamp I have like this.
Yeah.
So at any of the occasion when I am getting a match, a perfect match, then I reach to the conclusion that whether it is a just sideways normal, or it is inverted, or it is reversed, or it is reversed and inverted, all the silly mistakes have committed at a time.
That's great. That's great.
Have you seen something like this?
I was just going to say that what you've done is upped the ante on something that I don't know if he invented it, but he certainly used it all the time. In Ted Proud's books on postal history of mostly of the British colonies, where he had identified all of the different cancellations and he had copies of it on each page. You could buy from Ted Proud a copy of the page on that kind of translucent sheet, transparent sheet, so that you could hold the sheet over your cover and identify the postmark. So, and Ted Proud was going back, what, 40 or more years with that?
He passed away, right? Years back.
What's that?
Passed around.
Ted Proud passed away a few years back.
Yes, yeah.
I used to meet him all the time at Stampex. I know him very well, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Nice
Great man, an amazing philatelist, published 80 volumes on postal history in his lifetime. I've got some 30 in my collection of books, but
yeah, I have many. I know. What I used to call him, that Ted Proud doesn't has a switch off button. He born like that. He was always doing something. Whenever I meet him, oh, Martin, I'm working on this, I'm working on that, I'm doing this. Do you have that area? Do you have this area?
He was doing his 3-volume set on airmail before planes were flying, I think.
That's scary.
Yeah. So you said he created the illustration of the postmarks, but not the watermark, right?
No, not for watermarks. I've not seen that before on watermarks, but Mark-Ann, that's a brilliant idea. And I'm going to mercilessly copy it when I can.
Wonderful.
It's yours.
Mark.
There is no copyright whenever anything comes from Mark and Dave. There is no copyright. We are here to enjoy the hobby, right?
Work
Yes,
together.
indeed we are.
CJ
Yes,
is
indeed.
Thank you.
nodding in agreement.
So I have printed actually this entire sheet. The full sheet I have printed, one copy of the entire sheet. This is the only central portion of the watermark. I have printed the entire sheet, one I gave to Royal Philatelic Society Expert Committee. So whenever any stamps comes for the 1 ANA watermark, they just take the stamp and put it on the appropriate portion of the transparent sheet, 1 minute job, and it's complete. And one I gave to BPA. And today I promise you one I will give to APS Expert Committee.
Thank you.
And it's a gentleman promise.
I love it.
Yeah, thank you. Friends, I am going to share my screen. I want to show you Mr. Scott Tiffany from the APRL. He collected some of these references for you to be able to, that we have available in our library. So if there's any, I'll put it up on social media, but in case you wanted to screenshot anything, there's 2 pages. So I'll scroll, I'll go, I won't go too quickly. We had a question about, because now I can't see my screen, about the Washington Franklins. Who was that, friend? Somebody, if they want to unmute themselves. Let's see. John, would Washington Franklins in single, double, unmarked watermark have different paper thicknesses? You got 3 minutes.
Whoa. Would they have different paper thicknesses? Well, there's certainly different papers independent of the watermark for the Washington Franklin series. But if the question is whether a double line watermark or a single line watermark would be more deeply embedded, I absolutely have no idea. That's a fascinating question, but I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you.
But I know some people who do. Right? In our expertising practice, about 50% of what we do is U.S. stamps. The rest is rest of the world. About 1/3 of that, or 17%, is Washington Franklin's. It's our most popular area of expertising. I am blessed, absolutely blessed, with 6, 7 members of the expert committee that are all specialists in Washington Franklin's. So I will get an answer to that question.
Anybody? Oh, no. We want you to be able to talk, Markin, for sure. It's important. And Bob Zahn, go ahead, hon. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Sorry, I had to figure out how to unmute. Can you hear me?
Welcome, Bob. Yes, sir, hon. Go ahead.
So Gary, very much appreciated the presentation. Could you go back to either one of the 2 primary charts that you had where you were measuring stamps and explain how you would read that to indicate a color?
Well, let's see if I can. Okay, well, I can't share my screen at the moment, so because Heidi is grabbed that.
Yep. Got it.
All right, now let's see. Nah, I'm still unable to share.
Scott, Gary, if you can't do it, it's fine. Maybe that would be a topic for another session, is how you would go through and read some of those charts.
Yeah,
Okay, well, hang on just a sec. Let me see.
not a bad idea, because we are at the 4 o'clock.
Okay,
Yeah, I think he can share now, I think.
Yes.
yeah. Okay. Look, these are comparative measures and they aren't really telling you what color it is. It's just telling you how the ink is behaving across a spectrum of reflected light from, in this case, 400 to 1000 nanometers. So there's 600 data points that are being collected, and you can see the mapping of those data points across 600 nanometers of range. It's not really telling you this is color A or color B. It's telling you comparatively how the ink is reflecting light at different measures. So this isn't going to tell you what the color is. It's going to tell you how the color is behaving. The likelihood that two different colors would behave in the same way is pretty slim, although not zero. We're dealing with averages here, by the way. Each one of these lines that you see is the average of 3 different measures that were taken. So we're looking at 6 different stamps here. Each of those lines is the average of 3 points on the stamp, hopefully the same point on each stamp, because you get different ink densities and all kinds of variations. Printing is not a perfect science even today. So you want to take 3 different points off each stamp, measure it, and that's how you're going to get these kinds of curves. But it's not going to tell you the name of the color or in this case, not even going to tell you anything about the components of the ink. Only the way the ink is reflecting reflecting light that we're illustrating here in this graphic fashion. So there are ways out there with colorimeters to come up with things that would be the name of the stamp, if you will. But since there are no consistent naming conventions, Gibbons is different from Scott, is different from a non-philatelic source like Pantone, for example. I've always thought that we should all use Pantone colors for naming our stamps. Because that really defines the universe far more effectively than any philatelic source has. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but it's a good question. I just don't happen to have a great answer.
So maybe it's another chart and another topic, but even looking at the chart that you posted, there were what, 6 different lines on that chart. And we're, as Heidi said, we're past time, but I'd be interested in understanding how to read that chart, what each of the lines means, et cetera.
Each of the lines is a different stamp. So what that showed is that there were 2 clusters of 3 up at the right end of the chart that were really different. So I had basically those were 3 stamps each from 2 clearly different printings, and that's really what I was able to determine using that measurement. Couldn't name the colors particularly. Certainly not from this kind of a metric, but at least I could determine that of the 6 stamps that I was measuring, they were from 2 identical print runs, 2 different batches.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks for going over for Bob's question. Friends, you can always get in touch, Gary, and I'm only saying this because Gary's always so generous with his email. You can email Gary at gary@stamps.org if you would like to take this conversation offline. As per usual, when Gary's on, it's a chatty bunch. So thank you so much, everyone, for bringing your questions and truly your enthusiasm and curiosity. We really appreciate that, and all the collective schema that's shared. So thank you so much for joining us. Tomorrow, or on Wednesday, excuse me, at 3 p.m., we will have Casey Joe on. She's going to be speaking about fake U.S. stamps and the forgers who printed them. So We look
All right.
seeing you on that show at 3 p.m. Eastern. Invite a friend. Remember, 2020, it's all our responsibilities to recruit members. And please do check out the library. It's available online for non-members, and I will have those references curated by Scott Tiffany available with this recording. So be on the lookout for that on all the different social media platforms. Until Wednesday, stay safe. Thank you, Gary. Thanks everybody for your membership and for joining us online. Thank you, Markin, for joining us all the way from India. Thank you, friends.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
and thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you for coming from all over the world.
Bye-bye.
Peace. Peace.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, friends. Bye, Tom. I can't hear you. Okay. Aloha, everyone.